Stay connected is also something that Kenya Power would like to remind you that, we can get connected onto the grid and stay connected on the grid. And the grid, hopefully, will stay
connected to you.
Energized. Powered. Hasa hapo ndio maneno iko. Now we have the Managing Director and CEO of Kenya Power joining us, Engineer Dr. Joseph Siror. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation again.
Thank you.
Last time you were here, I wasn't here, but I was watching. And I was like, all right. Kumbe hii ndio maneno inaendelea hii Kenya Power. Hey. Okay, so we'll have a conversation, and also there are very many questions that have been asked of Kenya Power for a long time. We'll open up the phone lines at some point so people can engage you directly. Various issues from connectivity to tariffs to billing to you will hear. City has the day's proverb, and this week the proverbs are from Zanzibar.
Yes. Ukipenda boga, penda na ua lake.
Engineer, listen to that carefully. Ukipenda
boga, sio mboga, boga, penda na ua lake.
Do you get it, Engineer? What is boga?
No, I don't know what boga is.
Pass.
But I think from what he has, or how it appears, it recognizes the fact that when you take something, you must take it the way you find it.
Take it as is.
Exactly. Like possibly when you take a rose, it may also have some thorns on it, but it is beautiful and it's good. But there are certain aspects of it you might not really, it may not be to your liking, but the fact that you've opted for it, then you have to take it with what it comes along with.
City?
Absolutely. Now the English translation is, if you love a pumpkin,
Okay.
also love its flower. So you are absolutely right.
It's about a pumpkin. So boga is pumpkin.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you love a pumpkin, also love its flower.
Yes.
Sabi sana. Sabi sana. Now there are very many things about Kenya Power. I just want to start with when we had a big power outage the other day on IMD. What was it? The nationwide power outage. There was a lot of conversation. People tried to explain themselves. The others were not trying to explain them. There was so much happening. And then question of being asked, so, but why is nobody living at Kenya Power? But before we talk about living, what exactly happened?
Agreed. Latif is something that operates, that has a lot of complexity in it. I think at times when we see the power is on, it may not be very evident what is involved for that power to actually be there. There is one of our most crucial installations, which is the National Control Center. And this is the center of activity where when you see power flowing at any part of the country, then it means that there is a team who are really actively looking at ensuring that grid is available. In Kenya, for example, apart from what is called the off-grid stations, and the off-grid stations are the ones which are running on generators, the likes of Lodwar and some far-flung towns, those ones run on their own generators, but the rest of the grid is connected. What I mean by connected, and I think you had even mentioned such a word, energized and connected, what that means that what happens in one part of the country will also affect the entire grid. In an interconnected grid, you have a failure in one part, and if you don't manage it well, it can cascade and you get a total failure. Now, in terms of for power and for even this place to be receiving this power, there are a number of interventions at different levels. At the most critical level or the initial level is generation. There are those who generate this power that we're using right now. And this generation, again, may not be in one location. Like the biggest generations could be the hydros, which are in the Seven Forks. We also have, not even the hydros actually, geothermal now is the highest. And when you look at geothermal source as a source, Latif, we have a capacity, or rather the generation capacity for geothermal right now stands at 940 megawatts. And the next in line is the hydros. The hydros do about 839. And these are hydros that are spread. Of course, the largest, like I said, is the Cascade. That is the Seven Forks. But we even have one on the northern part of Kenya, which is called the Tarkwel. And that one generates about 106. But when you sum the total of all that is generated from hydros, it comes to 839. The next in line now would be what is called the variable renewable energy sources. We are talking here about solar and wind. And here we have the largest plant being the Lake Turkana wind power. And I think it is even stated to be the largest in Africa. It generates its maximum capacity is 310 megawatts. And then we also have some wind sources, one in Gong, which is managed by Kengen. There is Kipeto, which is just near Isinya, over 100 megawatts. If you sum all the wind sources, we come to about 435. Next in line then would be the thermal sources. Thermal sources are the ones which are running on HFOs, the diesels. And when you look at the total, they have a total of 512 megawatts. And there is 60 megawatts which is generated in Moroni. So that is the space of where the thermals play in. And finally, you have the solar. The solar generation, there is biomass, which I don't really need to mention, is quite small. But the solar generation in the country is about 210 megawatts. Again, these are spread. There are 3 plants in Eldoret, which is the Selengei, Sedate, and Alton, each producing 40 megawatts, coming to 120. There is Garissa Solar, which is by REREC, which is in Garissa, about 55 megawatts. And then we have one which is called Malindi Solar. It's in a place called Weru. Now, when you look at that, we've talked about all the generation capacity. To move this power from where it's generated, like I've alluded to, these are spread across various corners of the country, is now where the transmission comes in. And maybe just for the sake of the listeners, what does happen at generation level? We generate at a much lower voltage. At times, it's about just 3,000 volts to about 11,000 volts. Now, the reason why, of course, it is generated at a level. But what kicks in next, Latif, is the transmission. Now, you have to move this power to the load centers where this power is required. So even that generation that we are doing in the northern part of Kenya, almost 435 kilometers away from Suswa, that's something about like the Lake Turkana, and then, of course, you come another 100 kilometers, that power is the one that could be supplying even this particular point right now. Actually, the whole generation come together to supply the demand that is there. Now, at the level of transmission, you have to take the voltage to be very high. Without really going into a lot of technicality, the higher the voltage you use to move power, the lower the losses. And this is really what the public should know. Whenever you move power from any location to the next, there must be losses. The only issue is, what do you want to allow for your losses? And the mechanism with which you can use to minimize them is to take it to the highest voltage possible. And then, of course, you also use the conductors that are as thick as possible. When you use a conductor that is very thick, then the losses, you'll never eliminate. You can only reduce the quantum. But the moment, again, you take the voltage to be very high, the more costly the infrastructure. It has to be carried by pylons, possibly in excess of 80, 100 meters tall. So one has to strike a balance always to what should I allow for the losses? Because if you want to minimize to the lowest, you really have to pay for it. So one strikes an economical balance where we say, no, let's allow this and let's compromise, use this size of conductors, use this voltage to move it.
Right.
Now, once you reach the destination, you now have to transform it to a lower voltage before finally you supply even to a studio like here, where 3-phase is 415, and if it's a single phase, it's 240. So that is the entire value chain of the movement of this power. Now, what happens at the national control? During the course of the day, the power demands in the entire grid will keep varying. When everyone is asleep, the power demand in this country is very low. It can even come as low as 100 megawatts. But the moment you reach about 6 p.m. in the evening, you notice the power now rising up, possibly from around 1700. In a short while, it's 1800, it's 19, it is 2000, and the maximum demand so far in the country is 2170. So what then happens, Latif, is that the guys at the National Control Center will keep monitoring the power demand, and they bring in generation to meet it. Because if the demand is higher than generation, the network will collapse. And it collapses because the frequency drops, and if it drops beyond a certain level, the system has a mechanism to protect itself from damage or from damaging the equipment it is applying. And it does it by tripping. Just like when you are in your house, if there is a short, you'll notice a click. Possibly the circuit breaker has actually tripped. The reason why it trips is to protect whatever equipment may be taking a lot of current, which could indicate it's getting burned. So the entire grid also is managed or is controlled by a very complicated protection system, where it keeps monitoring the two parameters which are kept monitored throughout the entire duration that power is applied is one, the frequency and the voltage. You want to maintain them to where they are meant to be. So that if your socket is to give you 240, then it monitors that it's not plus or minus 5%. So if it goes beyond 240 plus 5% of it, which is 12, then it should actually trip. So those are the parameters it keeps monitoring. On the frequency side, the frequency used in this country is 50 hertz. If it again drops beyond upper or lower, then it trips. So what happens is this, Latif. If the demand is higher than what is being supplied, the frequency goes down. And if it goes down beyond the thresholds, the protection system just shuts down to protect itself. And before you know it, at times you can have a national blackout. So what are the control mechanisms? We have what is called, to protect the system, we have what is called under-frequency load shedding. Under-frequency or over-frequency. The two are opposite to one another. Under-frequency occurs when you lose a generation or the demand is higher than the supply. If the demand is higher than a supply, it's almost like if you overload a lorry, it's no longer moving at the speed it ought to move.
Yeah.
Like if you drop a load onto it and it's moving, then it will attempt to start going slowly.
Yeah.
That is now the frequency coming down by virtue of the load is higher than what it can produce. And when that under frequency happens, we have different levels of load shedding, where automatically, the way the system is configured right now, if it drops, say, by less than 100 megawatts, it will go to under frequency load shedding 1. And in that, it just drops certain loads, which it knows is commensurate to that one. So instead of leaving the loads trying to overload the system, it sheds off some load so that now the two are balanced.
Okay.
But if it so happens, Latif, that the amount of power you have lost is so substantial,
Suddenly.
and it is sudden, that the protection system cannot mitigate it, then you could actually be staring at a blackout. And that is exactly what happened. On that material day, we lost 270 megawatts. If it was under 100, maybe even to about 150, the under-frequency load shedding schemes would just have dealt with it. But on this particular time, the quantum was so high that it was unable to respond to it as fast as it should have done if the network was to be maintained. And
How
that's
did
exactly
we
what happened.
lose 200 megawatts suddenly?
No, in terms of maybe again to debunk that, there are a lot of trips in the course of the day. Like even as we are here today, there could be a tree which has fallen on one part of the network. And the network that we have, Latif, like I mentioned elsewhere, we have a network that is 290,000 kilometers long. 290,000. The circumference of the Earth along the equator is just about 40,000. So the network size that we are dealing with is almost 8 times round the circumference of the Earth along the equator. That is a massive and a very long network. And in that part, when you have such a massive network, Latif, you would have situations where possibly a tree is falling on one part of the network. And ordinarily, when you have what is called a short circuit, a lot of current is drawn, and that's actually why at times you see fire and you see burning. And that in itself would even appear like a load. It would appear like a very big load has been thrown onto the grid at a particular instance.
And the system then isolates it.
So those are trips that do occur across the entire network. And the main issue is just that in most of the situations that could be even happening right now, the quantum is so small that the load shedding, the under-frequency load shedding would actually be able to deal with it. But now, where the quantum is so high, that is actually where you could be staring at a national blackout. And that's exactly what happened on non-material day, when we lost 270 megawatts. And it so happened again that it was happening at a time when the hydrology, what I mean by hydrology, that is a common terminology we use, when the water levels are not as good, and that means the amount of power you are generating from the hydro sources is a bit low. One of the most stable sources, Latif, in terms of generation and stability, are the hydros. The hydros, because they are very heavy turbines. So even when there is a disturbance, the turbine will still, like once you've rolled up a very heavy wheel,
it will continue.
And even if something happens, it will still continue even if there is some resistance. Now, when we deal with what is called the variable intermittent sources like solar and wind, those ones don't have that what is called inertia. Inertia means now that once you've pushed it and it's really rotating, then it cannot stop at an instant. Wind and solar are opposite. A cloud cover just comes and you could be generating the maximum and it can drop to zero. And those ones normally pose a very big challenge in terms of managing the stability of the
So, engineer, on this day,
yes,
how did we lose 230 megawatts?
270.
270.
There was just a trip. It's a trip. And like I said, a trip does occur. The system itself sensed that there was a fault somewhere, which was not really an issue. A system can always misdiagnose and possibly something unrelated. It may think that is a risk and it starts protecting itself.
So do you know now what caused the trip on this particular line? Because it obviously is a trip from one transmission line that is feeding from one generator.
No, it's actually a generation that tripped.
Okay.
It's a generation that tripped. And what was more important to us, we tried to locate what could have caused that to trip, and we didn't quite isolate it. But the only thing that we came to the conclusion because we also have to look at the settings of our systems, is to see what should happen if it notices such a fault. And on this particular instance...
So wait, before we even go to what should happen, we are saying that today we do not know what caused the trip.
Yeah, we don't. The system itself noticed a particular condition on the grid.
Okay.
That condition
was
on
the
the
trip
grid...
because of transmission, or was the trip at the generating station?
It happened at the generating station, but when you look at what the things actually that tripped is what is called the STATCOM. And these STATCOMs are the ones which monitor the voltage of a particular bus to ensure that it is stable. On this particular instance, Latif, from the generator, the STATCOMs saw a condition on the grid. And this condition on the grid made it believe that this was a very big risk and it needed to protect itself.
What did it see?
Now, it saw a fault, but that fault, we are unable to trace it. But the important factor which I just wanted to highlight was, how do we mitigate against such? Because the systems will always see certain conditions on the line and they may misdiagnose it and react in a negative way. On this particular instance, what they did notice is that when this particular system would see a fault, it would take a very short time before it protects itself.
Okay.
And if it's an erroneous and a spurious, you can have a spurious event. I mean, in a grid that size, a small thing happening in one part of the country, one may actually misinterpret it and think and overestimate the impact and start protecting itself. Because you see, the purpose of a protection system, Latif, is to ensure, because these installations are very expensive. And if it's truly a fault, the more you remain in without protecting yourself, the more you risk the damage of that equipment. So there has to be a balance between two things. How long should you remain in before you react, or should you react immediately? And those are now the settings we had to work on, because we did notice that the particular system was using a non-standard time to get out before remaining. It's meant to remain for a period of about 600 milliseconds. So once you see a fault, do not just instantaneously trip. And that is actually what exactly happened for that one. So we would not even fault it for seeing a fault. We faulted it for operating instantaneously.
Okay.
If it had remained for the 600 milliseconds, which is what was required, and if it remained for that long, we would not have lost the grid, then of course we would not have lost it.
So you're saying here that you were not able to trace exactly where the fault was. Till now, we're not sure what caused that particular fault. So then in rectifying that, how then were you able to rectify at that point? Because, there were some hours before there was the restoration of power. Some parts of the country then were restored much later than the rest. And then also to see that to mitigate against something from happening in the future, how can you do that if you do not know what caused this problem at this point?
What I said is that in a grid this big, there are a number of things, and indeed I did even mention that right now as we are talking, there might be some small trips happening in part of the network. And some of those trips could be legitimate. They could actually be arising out of a true fault. But a number of times the protection systems might be seeing certain occurrences and misinterpret it to be something serious, and then it would trip. And the main issue is, and that's actually what I was focusing on, how do we mitigate? In this particular instance, this generation, or rather the output that came from the protection systems, because we are able to once after a blackout has occurred, maybe just again for the sake of the public, we are able to go to each of these plants and download information from relays. We have what is called a disturbance record. A disturbance record, you are able to go to any plant, download it, and see to the most minimal time how the system behaved before it collapsed. And you'll actually see the waveforms about the current, the voltage, and all this, and why it behaved that way. For this particular generation, it saw a voltage dip in the network. I mean, this particular plant. But when we checked the network, there was no such voltage dip. And of course, we tried trying to really establish why it saw it, and it never made sense. So we focused then on, assume it actually did see a voltage dip, which of course we could not trace it in the rest of the network. We then said, how did the system behave? And one of the things that we did notice is after it saw this voltage dip, it reacted immediately, which is now what was abnormal. And those are now the settings that we had to have them adjusted, so that instead of them responding very quickly to a dip, and indeed, maybe just for the sake of the public again, in a protection system, we have what is called zones of protection. What I mean by a zone of protection, if the system is able to know from where I am and where I'm seeing this fault, is it nearest to me or nearest to my neighbor? If it's nearest to me, then I should be the first one to react. So there are actually time differences. I would say, for example, if the fault is in my reach, then I should react within 20 milliseconds. And my nearby system is also configured to say, if I see there is a fault in my neighbor and it does not respond within 20 milliseconds, then I would assume that this protection system has failed, so I should actually start responding. So the one that should respond the first is the one nearest to the fault. It is actually called protection grading, where you configure which one should react first. There is zone 1, zone 2, the backward zone. There are a number of things one configures. And the whole essence is so that if it is nearest to me, then I should be the one to react first. But if after, you should wait. You should not, as a neighbor, start responding to my
To somebody
fault.
else's fire
Yes, somebody else's fire
before they call you.
within the 20 seconds. I should wait for you to respond first. If you don't respond, then I see my neighbor is in trouble, so I should actually kick in and maybe save him. So in this particular instance, the time it took to respond, while it would appear that it was seeing a fault far away from it, was shorter than it should have had. And those are actually the things now we are saying. This protection system needs to be configured. We need to see what are the reaction times and what are the times it should actually have waited before responding.
You were going to a break.
You have a burning question, ask it, and then we'll take the break.
Well, it's a two-pronged question.
Yes.
One, yes, the protection system seems to have been a bit over-enthusiastic.
Yes.
Clearly. But in giving us a blackout, if, let's say, there was a genuine fault and it did not react,
Yes.
would the damage have been far greater in terms of what it would cost us and what the effect would be? And is that enthusiasm by the protective system justified?
No, for a protection system, Muga, the main challenge would be if, for example, you don't protect yourself. I'm talking about the STATCOMs in question. And it's so because why would you protect yourself? That would mean the currents flowing in the network may be of a degree that it will damage the equipment.
Yes.
And if it doesn't protect itself and it now exposes itself to that damage, and it so happens that STATCOM now gets damaged, it may take over a year to get another one. So the challenge would be the impact on the wider grid would be so massive that you actually don't want to envisage it. Because the generation then from that part of the country, which could be 300 megawatts, you may not have it for a whole 1 year. And if you load shed 300 megawatts for a whole year, Muga, that would actually be too expensive. So the protection systems are there to ensure you really, one, it is not just to protect itself. It is to protect whatever may also suffer as a result of that fault. Because that would mean if it's a true fault and it could be a factory catching fire, then if I don't disconnect and trip this network, then that factory may be staring at a complete damage of that equipment or of whatever equipment they are using. So the whole essence of protection system is really to do that, protect.
So the lesser of two evils is that blackout we experienced.
Exactly. That is, if it was a true fault. Yeah, that is true.
Let us take a break. If it was a true fault, we'll continue this conversation shortly, 25 minutes to 9. We are hosting engineer Dr. Joseph Siror. He is the managing director and CEO of Kenya Power. The first part of this conversation has been on what happened on that day that we had a nationwide blackout that actually took very many hours to rectify and bring everybody back up on the grid. What exactly caused this? And then how do we mitigate against this? And how do we manage our power going forward? This conversation continues shortly. Don't go away.
Spice.
With engineer Dr. Joseph Siror, MD, CEO, Kenya Power. Engineer, you've told us we operate on one giant grid that's very long, 8 times the circumference of the Earth through the equator. And that we're not the most highly connected country in the world. That means other countries should either have longer grids or they have many grids. Which is which?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Latif. It is true. There are countries which have, of course, longer grids and bigger grids. And possibly also some of them, especially if you're looking at the developed countries, the grids that support most of the network would be the very, very, very high voltage. And they have a lot of alternative paths and all that. But in our level of development, looking at even what has transpired over the last 10 years, Latif, I think we are on the right course. Because if you look at where we were about 10 years ago, we had only 2 million customers. Today, we have about 9.2 million. That is almost close to 5 times.
That's
and
big
over just a 10-year period, that is really commendable. And if you look at 20 years ago, we had only 645,000. So really, looking at where we are today, vis-a-vis where we have come from, I think we are doing well.
But also you've told us that when you keep seeing those constant blackouts, because you'll have a constant blackout everywhere in the country, there'll be a moment you go, power is out for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes 6 hours or so. It's because of the system protecting the grid. Some fault will occur somewhere, the nearest relay or whatever will just isolate that system.
True.
But this doesn't happen with these other developed grids or bigger grids. Why do we keep seeing so many trips on our grid?
No, I think they do happen. The only difference is how are those grids. The most and the best, like possibly just going back to that again, protection system, Latif. Like I did mention, there are various things which can cause that disturbance. One of them, like I mentioned, is something like a tree falling or a shot happening somewhere. And in the protection systems, possibly just to highlight that before I come to that one, it looks at what kind of fault is it. One of the protection systems I could mention is what is called inverse of a current. So what we mean here is that if the current all of a sudden, let me just give an example, that where you have a line between 2 locations, I could mention here maybe between Suswa and Isinya. What is expected of the protection systems is that even when it is so loaded, there is a particular current that the line will be drawing. But suppose somebody mischievous throws a wire across to cause a short. Then the amount of current that would seek to flow to meet that short would be so high compared with what ordinarily that would be carried by the lines. So when it sees now a very big spike and a very high current, what the system has to do is that it looks at the magnitude. And if it sees that the magnitude is many, many times higher, then it knows that this is something I must react very quickly. And quickly it must. Otherwise, the damage would be very severe.
So what is the difference between ours and the others?
Now,
why do ours react fast?
Okay.
Maybe the others don't. I mean,
Yes.
why do other countries not witness as frequent blackouts as we do in Kenya?
I'm coming there, Latif. What happens? Like if you are to look at Kenya, Nairobi, let me talk about Nairobi, for example, before the year 2017. The main generation, the main line that would bring power from Olkaria would be what is called the Nairobi North. It's a line, it's a double circuit line from Suswa coming to Nairobi North, then Dandora, and it serves the other part of Nairobi. So what that would then mean is that in that past, that is 2017, if there was any fault on that line, you would have massive load shedding in Nairobi. You'd have several parts of the city without power source. So what is the best and what is the way forward in terms of addressing such a challenge? You have what is called a ring. you create a ring round critical load centers. What we mean by a ring is that you avoid the dependency of one supplying a major load center. So what did the country do? They introduced another ring to serve Nairobi. And this is the ring where you have a line coming from Suswa. It comes to a place called Isinya, about 106 kilometers. And then it comes to the river, or rather it comes to Embakasi, which is another 56 kilometers. And then it serves the wider Nairobi. So what that would mean then is even if you lost the line, the Nairobi North line, you as a customer, you not even notice it. Because the alternative path would actually be supplying you. So the main difference with all these developed countries is that they have so many alternative paths that serve the customers. So that one trip in one part of the network, you would not even know there was a trip. The fact would be that one would have come down, but you'll be getting supply from the alternate paths. So the main difference with most of these developed countries is now the number of these alternative sources that supply a particular customer. You are not supplied from a single source, you are supplied from multiple locations. And that is actually what is even happening in the country. It's only that if you look at Nairobi, there are still a number of stations. If you look at Nairobi, it's called Nairobi Ring, which had a number of substations. One of them is in a place called Kemuka. I have a feeling it's going to be complete later part this year. There was, of course, the one in Isinya. That one is complete and functional. There was at the river, which was completed sometime last year. There is also what is called Mala, in a place called, at times it's called Mala. It used to be called Komorok, but that one is still under construction. So once all these rings are completed, then, of course, the impact in terms of the trips that may occur in one part of the network is going to be lesser and lesser. So the more interconnected, the more alternate paths that you have, what is at times called N-1 criteria, where if you lose one, you are still being supplied from another part of the country. As we deal with that, Latif, then, of course, our challenges are going to be addressed much more. That is now from a transmission, distribution level. But when you again come to the issue of the sources, Latif, and indeed I think Kenyans should know this, we are not now in a very good position in terms of our generation. We are actually at almost staring at a very big risk. And that is why, in fact, one of the conversations we have been engaging both the government and even the parliament is to lift the moratorium on generation. We are really staring at a serious issue. And the reason is that over this period, we have had very low rains in this part of the country, or rather in the country, and the level of water in the dams is really worrying. In fact, for the better part of the last 3 weeks, Masinga has actually not been generating. Zero generation.
3 weeks.
In fact, it may be slightly more than 3 weeks. Or at times, if it generates, it's not generating the better part of the day. Maybe most of the day it's off, and then it generates just a few hours of the day. So when you look at the dam situation in the country right now, it is quite poor, what is called poor hydrology. And when you have to depend on the variable sources, I'm talking about the variable renewable in terms of the wind and solar, these are not sources which we regard as baseload. What we mean by it's not baseload, they can decide not to be available when you need it. And you see the average Kenyan, Latif, they are told that we have a lot of sources. And this is really a myth that we need to debunk.
How so?
They are told that in Kenya, we have an installed base of 3,200.
Yes.
And you see, in arriving at this 3,200, Latif, they have assumed the 940 megawatts from geothermal is available. All of it. But the truth of the matter is, even as we talk, there may be a plant which is undergoing maintenance.
How much of it is actually available, really available?
At times, depending on what is, for geothermal, we call it a base load. So unless when it is being maintained, and those things do happen in terms of maintenance, you would be having possibly upwards of close to that 900 megawatts.
Engineers, Siror, please, I think it is important for us to break this down a little bit.
Okay.
Because there are folks who are sitting here and looking at the threat of load shedding.
Yes.
Looking at the threat of load shedding, because based on what you're saying now, that is a huge possibility.
Absolutely.
If you have dams that are not generating at capacity because of reduced levels of water.
Absolutely.
Right? Now, when we look at alternate sources of power, solar, when you look at others, wind, which we've been told is in copious amounts, but the generation factor is probably what we are looking at now as what you're explaining to be the reason why it cannot be a reliable source. Now, this is what we need you to explain. If we are told it is available in copious amounts, but the generation factor is the problem, can you connect those two so that we can understand it as somebody who was going to grade 3 would
Okay.
understand.
Now, what happens is that, like I mentioned, the wind expected, or what we call installed capacity is 435 megawatts. But wind, is affected by many variables. I think, was it sometime last week, when I noticed Lake Turkana wind power was actually generating 2 megawatts. Two, yes. At times it can even go to 0. And this is one, is meant to generate 310. But let me also correct the perception that possibly it's not a good plant. No. If you compare with other wind sources in the world, Lake Turkana wind power is one of the most stable wind sources in the country, or rather even in the world. But still, the issue of intermittence it's an intermittent source. And an intermittent source means it can vary. It can drop.
Sometimes we have strong winds, sometimes we don't have strong winds.
Absolutely.
And you need constant strong winds in order for this power to be generated.
No, to meet the demand.
To meet the demand.
Because you see, if I was banking on the fact that I would get 300 megawatts from Lake Turkana to supply the demand today. And it so happens, and indeed I think when it rains, those are actually the times it just drops to almost 0. So, in fact, I think it was sometime last week when I checked the total, and it was during the day, I think around 4 p.m. When I checked the total intermittent sources, what were contributing to the grid, and it was only 140 megawatts. And this 140 megawatts, what was it meant to be if all of it was available? It was meant to be 435 from wind plus 210 from solar. So that would have meant 645 megawatts. So, a contribution where I was expecting to get 645 megawatts, I was only getting 140 megawatts. So in a situation where I have banked on it to supply the demand for the day, unless I have other sources which are there for them to start filling this gap when they are required, then you could actually be staring at a situation where you have to load shed. And that's actually where even the thermal sources do come in. A number of times, I think we've really demonized the IPPs and especially the thermal sources. Whereas, really, in terms of what they do contribute to us not load shedding, they actually play the most crucial role. Because it's in such times when these other sources are unavailable that they can be kicked in very quickly to actually come and fill this gap.
And they are stable.
Yeah, of course, thermal sources, because it's
controlled generation.
It's controlled. You just bring them in when you need them. Of course, you can still have sometimes when they're also on maintenance, and you might need them and they may not be available. But by and large, they are better in the sense that you can bring them up, ramp them up quickly, and then it fills that gap. And indeed, one of the other situations that has been we have been facing is Ethiopia, which is meant to be giving us 200 megawatts. Now, for maybe close to 2-3 months, they have been unable to give us the 200.
Because of
why?
Hydrology. They are again affected. And indeed, you see,
have a big
Ethiopia just finished filling this dam that has controversy.
but
just the other day.
Renaissance.
But that is not the only one. And I don't think they have even filled it. So the whole issue would be the same issue we have of hydrology in terms of the poor water levels in the dams.
It's in the region.
It actually affects the region. And you see, to a layman, Latif and Muga, they would assume, and they know that the capacity of the line that was constructed between Suswa and a place called Wolaita Sodo, it's a distance of 1,033 kilometers. 612 being on the Kenyan side, about 433 being on the other side. Now, if you look at that, the public would know, and indeed this is true, that the capacity of that line is 2,000 megawatts. And at times you would hear Kenyans saying, now, we have in Kenya a connection to Ethiopia which can bring in 2,000 megawatts. Why don't we bring that power and we display some of this? Of course, in theory, that sounds very good. But the truth of the matter is, they may also not be having that power really. More than what
and for months now, we have not been getting.
Right.
No, we have not been getting the
There's so many indicators here that perhaps it's time to really seriously consider these other sources for power generation. You've told us that Masinga is operating at well below capacity. You've told us that even the 200 megawatts that we're supposed to be getting from Ethiopia has not been happening. So you can pinpoint the problem already.
Our wind is not winding.
Wind is not winding, but the sun is shining. But then we are not... We can see the problem hitting us in the face, left, right, and center. But that there seems to be a reluctance then to go towards these alternate sources. still saying that, yeah, well, maybe we can get something out of Masinga, but it's not happening. But there's another source which we say, okay, has this problem or not? What is wrong with then tapping into this other source, solar, for example, and then putting in the infrastructure that is required to make it work as a source for power?
No, like I said, what we really need at this moment, and it's really good, and that's why I really love the fact that we are having this conversation in the country at the moment, is there have been a lot of myths that people have believed in. They have always believed that 3,200 megawatts that we say is installed capacity in Kenya is available. And the truth of the matter is that it is not. And the beauty of having this conversation is for each and every person to really realize that the situation is not as rosy as we may have been thinking, and we need to immediately embark on a mechanism to address this. What we do require the most right now in the country is not another intermittent source. So I would not really be encouraging.
Is solar an intermittent source?
Exactly. When a cloud just covers or it rains, it drops to zero. Like I was mentioning last week, I don't know what it is right now, when solar was meant to be giving me 210 and wind was meant to be giving me 435, 3645, both of them, solar and wind, were only giving me 140.
So what's the solution? And I think that's the question that we're asking now. What is the solution?
The solution, number one, is to increase the base loads. What I mean by base loads here, let's fast track the geothermal projects. There's one geothermal which was completed recently and is really assisting us. This is a social energy which is in Menengai. It's giving in that 5 megawatts. And it came, by the way, with the lowest tariff. It is the one we are paying about 7 shillings. It's even lower than the one for Kenyan. And now that one is very helpful. There are 2 others which are meant to be done in Menengai. There is one by Or Power and there is another one by, I believe, Globalec. Now it is 35 each. There's some activity again on geothermal happening in parts of Baringo. It's a place called Paka and Silale. Those ones need to be fast-tracked. There are some small hydro plants which are scattered all over the country. There is even one called Gogo in somewhere in South Nyanza owned by Kenyan. They need to fast-track it so that it produces more power. So we really need to look at what are some of these stable sources and fast-track and lift the moratorium that was imposed by National Assembly in terms of dealing with the NNU PPS, especially for the base loads. For the intermittent sources and the best going forward would be not to really slam brakes on them, but to ensure that anyone that is going to come on board has a mechanism of maintaining the generation. The way it can have that mechanism is by use of battery storage, or another mechanism of ensuring, should a cloud cover, say, affect a particular where the plant is, then they have another generation that will rise up to fill that gap. Otherwise, if they come the way they come, it still poses a very big risk.
So if it's solar, they should have solar and some sort of thermal on the side.
Or maybe battery storage.
Or battery storage.
Or even wind with battery storage.
Please explain battery storage.
Battery storage, Muga and Latif and Do, is a mechanism where you have some batteries, where as it is generating, it's also filling these batteries. In the event there is a drop, say there is a cloud cover, for example, or it starts raining over the place where the solar plant is, and we are talking about when it's dark clouds, it's raining heavily, then these batteries now start generating to meet that shortfall. If it was, say, generating 40 megawatts, now that it's raining heavily and there is no generation from the solar, these batteries will step in to bring in that 40 megawatts. The only challenge at times would be they may not last that long. But at least what it does happen, and this is where really some of the factors, or rather the benefits, can be realized. When you have like passing clouds, you will have a situation, Latif and Muga and Do, where when the cloud cover goes away, there is a spike generation of, say, 40 megawatts. And when there is this spike, which is just being injected on this grid, there is a frequency rise. The frequency actually responds to that. And when there is that spike going up, the cloud comes again, it drops. It causes what is called a lot of frequency dips on the network. And that frequency dip alone, and indeed this has really affected the industry maybe for the sake of the listeners, when there are so many frequency dips arising from these intermittent sources, I'm talking about from the wind and solar, you have a situation at times where the industry sensitive operations which require constant frequency, they have to get out of the grid and they use generators. And that in itself is quite negative. So we really need mechanisms of ensuring we mitigate
Reliability.
again. No, it's more of quality. This is now more of quality sources. That is, you are generating constant frequency with no dips, and that is where mainly the battery storage would need to come in to eliminate those dips and improve the power quality in the network.
We're going to the news, City.
Okay.
Let's go to the news. That question. Just ask it so that we all know. We can remind you what the question was asked.
It's about battery storage.
Okay.
Yes.
Because even I have the same. You'd think that would be obvious.
No, it's not obvious, clearly. That's why I'd
But
like
you
to...
have this solar and then you have battery and then, in the event. Okay. Anyway, we continue this conversation in the next hour. And at some point in the next hour, we'll open up the phone lines. Let people engage with the Kenya Power Managing Director and CEO, Engineer Dr. Joseph Siror, who is our guest this morning. We are talking about the Kenya Power and, the reliability of this particular company to give us constant power in our homes, in our businesses, everywhere. What's happening? What do we need to do? It's 9 a.m. Good morning.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.